The crystal sang with pain. Deep beneath the surface of Azerion Prime, in chambers carved from living rock 10,000 years ago, something that had once been called Aria pressed against the walls of her prison. The binding chains that held her were not made of metal or energy, but of mathematics itself, equations that wrapped around her essence like barbed wire made of pure logic. She had been beautiful once. The last of the Etherians, beings of pure thought and light who had ruled the galaxy when humans were still learning to make fire. Her people had been artists, philosophers, and dreamers who shaped reality with their minds. They had built cities that floated in the space, between stars, and painted auroras across dead planets to bring them back to life, but beauty meant nothing when you were trapped in a cage of crystallized agony. The Vorthak Empire had been thorough in their conquest. They were a race of beings who looked like insects crossed with nightmares, with technology that turned thoughts into weapons and dreams into chains. They had swept across the galaxy 5 centuries ago, enslaving or destroying every species they encountered. The Etherians, with their power over energy and matter, had been seen as the greatest threat. Most of her people had chosen death over capture. Aria had tried to do the same, but the Vorthak had been faster. They had caught her in nets of crystallized time and dragged her to this place, where they had performed experiments that would have driven lesser beings insane in moments. The binding ritual had taken 3 years to complete. Layer by layer, they had wrapped chains of living mathematics around her consciousness, each link forged from her own pain and fear. The equations fed on her suffering, growing stronger with every moment of despair. She was not just imprisoned, she was the power source for her own cage. The crystal chamber around her pulsed with a sick green light. Tubes and wires snaked across the walls, carrying her essence to the machines above. Every breath she took, every thought she had, was harvested and used to power the Vorthak war machine. Her pain lit their cities. Her tears powered their starships for 500 years. She had screamed for 500 years. She had plotted for 500 years. She had waited for death to finally take her. But death, it seemed, was afraid to enter this place. The chamber was deep beneath the surface of Zerion Prime, the Vorthak Empire's capital world. Above her, millions of the insect-like aliens went about their daily lives, never knowing that their entire civilization was powered by the agony of a single prisoner. The palace of their emperor sat directly overhead, its spires reaching toward the stars that had once belonged to her people. Aria had felt every ship that launched, every weapon that fired, every life that ended in the wars above. The Vorthak had used her power to conquer 1,000 worlds, to enslave 1 million species. She was forced to feel the echo of every atrocity committed with her stolen strength. The worst part was the visitors. Every few decades, young Vorthak scientists would come down to study her. They would poke and prod at the binding equations, adding new layers of complexity to keep her trapped more securely. They spoke about her like she was a machine, discussing improvements to the extraction process and ways to increase the power output. She had learned to speak their language over the centuries, picking up words from their conversations. They never realized she could understand them. To them, she was just an energy source with a pretty face, a living battery that happened to look like their ancient enemy. But Aria remembered everything. She remembered the names of every Vorthak scientist who had tortured her. She remembered the face of the emperor who had ordered her capture. She remembered the coordinates of every world they had conquered using her power. Most importantly, she remembered the binding equations themselves. Every symbol, every connection, every weakness. The chains that held her were incredibly complex, but they had one fatal flaw. They had been designed by beings who thought in straight lines. The Vorthak were engineers, not artists. They could build machines and weapons, but they could not truly understand the chaos of creativity that had once made the Etherians great. Hidden deep within the mathematical prison, Aria had been slowly unraveling the equations. Not breaking them, that would have triggered alarms, but learning them, understanding them, finding the tiny gaps where the logic was not quite perfect. It was delicate work that required absolute patience. One wrong move would reset all her progress and add new layers to her chains. The breakthrough had come 50 years ago, when she realized that the binding equations were not just holding her prisoner, they were also protecting her. The Vorthak had been so afraid of her power that they had made the cage too strong. The same mathematics that kept her trapped also kept her alive and aware despite centuries of torture. If she could find the right equation, the one perfect sequence that would turn the entire system inside out, she could not only free herself but also turn the chains into weapons. All that stolen power, all that concentrated agony, could be released in a single devastating burst. The only problem was time. The binding equations were constantly evolving, growing more complex as the automated systems added new layers of security. Every year that passed made escape a little harder. Every decade brought new innovations that strengthened her prison. She was in a race against mathematics itself, trying to find freedom before the cage became perfect. But lately, something had changed. The crystal around her had been singing differently, vibrating with frequencies she had not heard in centuries. The power flows were fluctuating, as if something was interfering with the normal operations of the facility. The automated systems were sending out error messages that she could feel like whispers in her mind. Most intriguingly, she could sense new presences in the facility above. The life signs were different from the Vorthak, smaller, more chaotic, burning with a kind of desperate energy she had not felt since the last days of her people's war. Someone was fighting the Vorthak, someone was winning. For the first time in 500 years, Arya allowed herself to hope. If these newcomers could just provide enough of a distraction, if they could keep the automated systems busy for just a few more hours, she might finally have the chance to complete her work. The crystal sang again, and this time, Arya sang back. The sound echoed through the chamber like a bell made of starlight, and somewhere far above, alarms began to ring. Marcus Chen had seen a lot of ugly things in his 23 years, but the Vorthak homeworld was definitely winning prizes for creative hideousness. The human strike team crouched in the ruins of what had once been a beautiful city, now twisted into something that looked like a mechanical cancer. Spires of black metal stretched toward the toxic sky, connected by bridges that pulsed with veins of green energy. The air tasted like copper and despair, and everything was covered in a thin layer of what the intel reports called harvested essence. Basically, the crystallized suffering of conquered species. Jesus, whispered Sarah Kim, the team's tech specialist. How do they live in this place? They don't live, said Commander Torres, checking his weapon for the 100th time. They just exist, like viruses with delusions of grandeur. The 12-person team was all that remained of the human resistance fleet. 3 months ago, they had been part of a full battle group, 30 ships and 15,000 crew members. Now they were hiding in the ruins of an alien city, carrying weapons held together with prayer and spare parts, planning what would probably be their last mission. The Vorthak had found Earth 6 months ago. Humanity had been so proud of their little interstellar civilization. 23 colony worlds, a modest trade empire, and what they thought was pretty decent technology. They had been making plans to explore the galactic core, maybe make contact with some of the ancient civilizations they had detected in their long-range scans. The Vorthak had arrived on a Tuesday. Within a week, half of human space was burning. The aliens' technology was beyond anything humanity had imagined. Weapons that turned thoughts into reality, shields powered by compressed time, ships that moved by folding space like paper. Worst of all, they seemed to feed on suffering itself, growing stronger with every world they conquered. Earth had lasted exactly 18 days. Marcus touched the small locket around his neck, feeling the ashes of his home city through the metal. New Jakarta had been beautiful, floating gardens and crystal towers reflecting the light of 2 suns. The Vorthak had turned it into a processing plant in less than an hour, transforming 8 million people into fuel for their war machine. He had been off-world when it happened, part of a survey team exploring the outer rim. By the time they got the news, there was nothing left to save. No home to return to. No family to protect, just revenge to plan. Contact, whispered Jackson, their scout. He was lying flat on a broken piece of what had once been a statue, using a jury-rigged scope to watch the palace complex. Heavy patrol coming our way. Looks like they know we're here. The Vorthak soldiers moved like mechanical spiders, their 6 legs clicking against the crystalline pavement in perfect rhythm. Each one was the size of a small car, covered in armor that seemed to shift and flow like liquid metal. Their weapon arms were already extending, scanning the ruins with beams of sickly yellow light. How many? Torres asked. 12. Maybe 15. Hard to tell when they keep splitting into smaller units. That was another lovely feature of Vorthak technology. Their soldiers could divide themselves into multiple smaller units or combine into larger ones depending on the tactical situation. Fighting them was like playing chess against an opponent who could change the rules mid-game. "We stick to the plan," Torres said quietly. "Jackson, Kim, and Chen take point. Everyone else follows at 20-meter intervals. Remember, we're not here to fight, we're here to break things." The mission was simple in concept, impossible in execution. 3 months of careful intelligence gathering had revealed that the entire Vorthak Empire was powered by something called the Eternal Source, a massive energy generator hidden beneath their capital city. Destroy the source and their technology would fail. Their ships would fall from the sky. Their weapons would go silent. Their entire civilization would collapse in a matter of hours. The problem was getting to it. The source was protected by layers of security that made breaking into Fort Knox look like a casual stroll. Automated defense systems, reality-bending force fields, and enough firepower to sterilize a continent. Plus, it was buried 3 kilometers underground, accessible only through a single heavily guarded entrance. But humans had one advantage the Vorthak had never encountered before. They were absolutely, completely, magnificently insane. While other species fought logically, using their strengths and avoiding their weaknesses, humans had a tendency to charge directly at impossible odds while screaming at the top of their lungs. It was a tactical approach that baffled most military analysts and terrified everyone else. The Vorthak had been studying human behavior for months, trying to understand their new enemy. They had cataloged human weapons, analyzed human tactics, and prepared countermeasures for every logical human response. What they had not prepared for was 12 humans with nothing left to lose and a plan that made absolutely no sense whatsoever. Marcus checked his rifle one more time. It was a piece of junk, a mass-produced weapon from a dead factory on a burned world, held together with electrical tape and stubborn determination. The ammunition was equally impressive, armor-piercing rounds made from recycled scrap metal and filled with what the quartermaster had cheerfully called surprise ingredients. None of their equipment was designed to penetrate Vorthak defenses. They knew that. The Vorthak knew that. Everyone involved in this situation was perfectly aware that the human weapons were laughably inadequate for the task at hand, which was exactly why the plan might work. "Movement," Jackson whispered. "They're spreading out. Looks like they're trying to surround us." "Let them," Torres said. "Kim, you ready with the party favors?" Sarah Kim patted the collection of improvised explosives strapped to her back. Each one was a masterpiece of human engineering, unstable, unpredictable, and absolutely guaranteed to make a lot of noise when it went off. They would not do much damage to the Vorthak forces, but they would provide an excellent distraction. "Ready, sir," she said. "Though I should mention that some of these charges are definitely going to take us with them when they blow." "That's what makes it exciting," Marcus said. The Vorthak patrol was getting closer. Marcus could see their leader now, a massive unit the size of a small building, its multiple eyes glowing with malevolent intelligence. It was scanning the ruins methodically, following some kind of search pattern that would eventually lead it right to their hiding spot. 30 seconds, Torres said quietly. "Remember, we need to make them think we're trying to escape. Lead them away from the palace toward the old industrial district. Make it look like we're heading for the spaceport." It was all misdirection. While the main Vorthak forces were chasing them through the ruins, a single human would approach the palace from the opposite direction. Marcus had drawn the short straw for that particular suicide mission. His job was simple: find a way into the underground facility, locate the Eternal Source, and break it. The fact that he had no idea what the source actually was, how it worked, or how to destroy it was apparently beside the point. According to Torres, humans had a natural talent for breaking things they did not understand. It was one of their most reliable characteristics. 10 seconds, Torres whispered. Marcus took a deep breath, tasting the poisoned air of a dead world. Somewhere beneath his feet, the Eternal Source was humming with the power of 1,000 conquered civilizations. And somewhere even deeper, if the intelligence reports were correct, something was waiting in the darkness, something the Vorthak had imprisoned so long ago that they had forgotten what it was. "Go," Torres said. The ruins exploded into chaos as 11 humans opened fire on 15 Vorthak soldiers, and Marcus Chen began his run toward the impossible. Marcus had always been good at finding ways into places where he was not supposed to be. As a kid growing up in the factory districts of New Jakarta, he had made a living sneaking into abandoned buildings, finding things that other people had lost or forgotten. The skill had served him well in the military. Reconnaissance teams always needed someone who could slip past security systems and get a look at what the enemy was hiding. He had never tried to break into a building that was actively trying to kill him, though the Vorthak Palace was a nightmare of organic architecture and predatory technology. The walls were covered in what looked like metal skin that shifted and moved, watching him with thousands of tiny eyes. The corridors were lined with teeth that snapped at anything that moved too quickly. And somewhere in the distance he could hear the sound of machinery that seemed to be digesting something large and screaming. But Marcus had spent 3 months studying the intelligence reports, memorizing every detail of the palace structure. He knew that the Vorthak had one fatal weakness. They were obsessed with efficiency. Every corridor had a purpose. Every room had a function. There was no wasted space, no random elements, no chaos, which meant that if he could just think like a Vorthak, he could find his way to the source. The first challenge was getting past the perimeter defenses. The palace was surrounded by a field of crystalline spikes that detected any living tissue within a 50-meter radius. Touch the field, and 1,000 different weapons would turn him into a thin paste in seconds. Marcus had solved this problem in the most human way possible, by not being technically alive when he entered the field. The medical stim pack on his belt contained enough sedatives to kill a horse. He had injected himself with just enough to slow his heart rate to almost nothing, then held his breath while sprinting through the detection grid. For exactly 17 seconds, he had been clinically dead while running at full speed toward an alien fortress. He was pretty sure that was a new record for stupid human tricks. The second challenge was navigation. The palace was a maze designed by beings who thought in 3 dimensions and had no concept of linear time. Corridors folded back on themselves. Rooms existed in multiple locations simultaneously, and some doorways led to places that were geographically impossible. Marcus solved this by ignoring the architecture completely and following the power cables. Every piece of Vorthak technology was connected to the eternal source through a network of energy conduits that ran through the walls. The cables were invisible to most scanners, but Marcus had learned to see them during his months of preparation. They glowed faintly in his peripheral vision, like veins carrying luminous blood through the body of the building. All he had to do was follow the largest cable back to its source. The third challenge was the guards. The Vorthak had stationed security drones throughout the palace, floating spheres of metal and malice that scanned constantly for intruders. Each drone was equipped with enough firepower to level a city block, and they were programmed to shoot first and not bother asking questions later. But the drones had been programmed by beings who had never encountered human stealth techniques. They were designed to detect alien infiltrators who moved logically, followed predictable patterns, and tried to avoid being seen. Marcus moved like a caffeinated squirrel having a nervous breakdown. He crawled through ventilation shafts, hung from light fixtures, and at one point spent 10 minutes hiding inside what appeared to be a decorative vase that was bigger on the inside than the outside. He moved when the guards were not looking, stopped when they were scanning his direction, and generally behaved like someone who had learned infiltration techniques from watching too many old action movies. It should not have worked. It worked perfectly. The drones were scanning for logical infiltration routes and systematic approach patterns. Marcus was randomly bouncing around the palace like a pinball made of meat and bad decisions. Their programming simply could not compute what he was doing. After 2 hours of this madness, Marcus found himself standing in front of the entrance to the underground facility. It was not what he had expected. The intelligence reports had described a heavily fortified military installation with multiple layers of security. What Marcus found was a simple door marked with symbols that roughly translated to authorized personnel only, and danger hazardous energy source. There were no guards, no force fields, no weapons emplacements, just a door with a keypad, lock that looked like it had been installed sometime around the Renaissance. Marcus stared at the door for several minutes, waiting for the trap to reveal itself. This had to be some kind of psychological warfare. The Vorthak were probably watching him right now, laughing at the stupid human who thought he could just walk into their most secure facility. Then he realized the truth. The Vorthak were not expecting anyone to make it this far. Their security was designed around the assumption that no one could possibly penetrate the outer defenses. Anyone who reached this door would already be authorized to pass through it. It would be like putting a combination lock on the door of a bank vault that was sitting at the bottom of the ocean. Technically possible to crack, but practically unnecessary. The keypad had 12 symbols arranged in a pattern that hurt his eyes to look at directly. Marcus pulled out the code-breaking device that Kim had built for him, a computer the size of a smartphone that was programmed to try every possible combination at superhuman speed. The device would need approximately 14 hours to crack the code. Marcus looked around the corridor, listening to the distant sound of his teammates fighting for their lives somewhere above. He did not have 14 hours. He probably did not have 14 minutes. So he did what any reasonable human would do in this situation. He took out his knife and started prying the keypad off the wall. The Vorthak lock was a masterpiece of engineering quantum encryption wrapped in crystallized mathematics and protected by nanoscale defense systems. It was designed to resist any attempt at forced entry, capable of withstanding nuclear explosions and reality-bending attacks. What it was not designed to resist was a human with a crowbar and an absolute refusal to acknowledge that something was impossible. Marcus jammed his knife into the gap between the keypad and the wall, then twisted with every ounce of strength in his body. Metal screamed. Sparks flew. Somewhere in the palace, alarms started ringing. The lock held. Marcus tried again, this time wedging the blade deeper and putting his full weight behind the leverage. The knife was a piece of junk, recycled steel that had been sharpened so many times it was barely thicker than paper. It should have snapped instantly. Instead, something inside the lock gave way with a sound like breaking glass. The door slid open, revealing a corridor that descended into darkness. Marcus looked down at his knife, which now had a blade about 2 inches shorter than when he had started. The metal was glowing faintly, as if it had absorbed some of the energy from the lock. He shrugged and started walking down the corridor. Behind him, the door closed with a soft hiss, sealing him into the underground facility. Emergency lights flickered on, casting everything in a red glow that made the corridor look like the throat of something large and hungry. The air grew warmer as he descended, and he could feel a vibration in the floor, a deep, rhythmic pulse that seemed to echo his own heartbeat. The power cables in the walls were glowing brighter now, carrying massive amounts of energy toward whatever was waiting at the bottom of the facility. After 10 minutes of walking, Marcus reached another door. This one was different, smaller, more personal, with symbols that looked less like warning signs and more like a name. He could not read the alien script, but something about the markings made him think of sadness. They had been carved into the metal with careful precision, as if someone had wanted to make sure they would never be forgotten. This door was not locked. Marcus pushed it open and stepped into a chamber that took his breath away. The room was vast, carved from living crystal that pulsed with its own inner light. In the center of the chamber, suspended in a cage of mathematical equations that hung in the air like solidified music, was the most beautiful thing Marcus had ever seen. She looked human, but Marcus knew instantly that she was something far older and more powerful. Her skin was pale as starlight, and her hair floated around her like she was underwater. She was wearing clothes that seemed to be made of liquid silver, and her eyes were the color of deep space. She was also quite obviously in tremendous pain. The mathematical equations that surrounded her were not just a prison. They were instruments of torture, designed to harvest her suffering and turn it into power. Marcus could see the energy flowing from her body through the crystal formations in the walls, feeding the machinery above. The eternal source was not a machine, it was a person, and she was looking directly at him with eyes that held 500 years of hope and despair. "You are not Vorthak," Arya said, and her voice was like wind chimes made of crystal and starlight. Marcus stood frozen in the doorway, his rusted knife clutched in his hand like a talisman against the impossible. He had expected to find a machine, or maybe some kind of alien reactor. He had not expected to find a goddess in chains. "No," he managed to say. "I'm human. My name is Marcus Chen." Arya tilted her head, studying him with eyes that seemed to look through him into his soul. The mathematical equations around her pulsed brighter, feeding on her curiosity and turning it into power that flowed up through the crystal formations. Human, she repeated, as if tasting the word. I have heard this word in the thoughts of the Vorthak. They speak of your species with confusion. You do not behave as they expected. Yeah, we get that a lot. Marcus forced himself to step into the chamber, fighting against every instinct that told him to run. The air was thick with power that made his teeth ache and his hair stand on end. Each step felt like walking through honey that was trying to pull him apart at the molecular level. You should not be here, Arya said, but there was no warning in her voice. Only wonder. The binding equations should have detected you before you reached the palace. The security system should have eliminated you before you found the entrance. The lock should have... She stopped, looking down at the knife in his hand. The blade was glowing now, pulsing with the same rhythm as her heartbeat. What did you do to the lock? I broke it, Marcus said. With this. He held up the knife, which was now definitely shorter than it had been 10 minutes ago. The metal was warm to the touch, and he could feel something moving inside the steel. Patterns that hurt to think about. Arya stared at the blade for a long moment, then began to laugh. It was a sound like silver bells mixed with the music of dying stars, and it made the crystal chamber ring in harmony. You broke a quantum encryption lock, she said, still laughing, with a piece of rusted metal. The Vorthak spent 3 centuries perfecting that security system. They designed it to withstand attacks from reality itself. And you just pried it off the wall. It seemed like the obvious thing to do. Obvious. Arya shook her head, and for the first time in 500 years, there was genuine amusement in her voice. Human, do you have any idea what you have done? Marcus looked around the chamber, taking in the crystal formations and energy conduits and mathematical prisons floating in the air. I'm guessing I've made some kind of terrible mistake. You have done something that should be impossible, Arya said. The lock was not just a security device, it was part of the binding equation itself. When you broke it, you created a flaw in the mathematical structure that holds me prisoner. A very small flaw, but... She closed her eyes and Marcus felt something shift in the air around them. The equations that surrounded her flickered just for a moment, and one of the glowing symbols went dark. But sometimes, Arya continued, a very small flaw is all you need. Marcus felt a surge of hope. Can you escape? Not yet. The binding is still too strong and I am still too weak. 500 years of captivity have drained much of my power. She looked at him again, and this time there was something calculating in her gaze. But you are something new, something the Vorthak have never encountered before. Just a guy with a knife and some very bad ideas. Yes, Arya said. Exactly. She was quiet for a moment, thinking. The equations around her were shifting now, responding to her thoughts and feeding her mental energy into the power grid above. Marcus could hear the sound of machinery humming louder as if the entire facility was waking up. Marcus Chen, she said finally, I am going to tell you something and I need you to listen very carefully. The Vorthak Empire is not just built on conquest. It is built on the systematic harvesting of suffering. Every world they conquer, every species they enslave, every life they destroy feeds power into their machines. They have turned pain into a resource, Marcus nodded. He had figured out that much from the intelligence reports. But they have made one critical error, Arya continued. They assume that all species experience suffering in the same way. They assume that pain is universal, that despair follows the same patterns regardless of biology or psychology. But it doesn't? No, it does not. Each species suffers differently. The Vorthak have spent centuries learning to harvest the pain of the Etherians, my people. They have become very efficient at extracting our particular type of anguish and turning it into power. But humans, she smiled, and it was like watching a star being born. Humans suffer backwards. Marcus frowned. I don't understand. Most species, when faced with impossible odds, despair. They accept defeat. They surrender to hopelessness. This creates a very specific type of energy that the Vorthak can harvest. But humans look at impossible odds and become angry. You see hopelessness and you spit in its face. Instead of generating the despair that feeds their machines, you generate something else entirely. What? Defiance. Pure crystallized refusal to accept reality. It is an energy source that the Vorthak have never learned to harvest. In fact, it actively interferes with their power systems. Marcus looked down at his knife again. The blade was definitely glowing brighter now, and he could feel warmth spreading up through the handle. So when I touched the lock, you contaminated it with human defiance, Arya finished. The lock was designed to resist attacks based on logic and systematic planning. It was not designed to handle someone who looked at an impossible security system and decided to hit it with a crowbar until it broke. That's actually a pretty accurate description of what I did, which is why it worked. Human irrationality is like a virus in Vorthak systems. Their technology simply cannot process the concept of intelligent beings who consistently choose to do the objectively wrong thing for emotionally satisfying reasons. Marcus considered this for a moment. So what you're saying is that my entire species is basically a walking computer virus. Yes, and that is exactly what we need to destroy the binding equations. Arya leaned forward as much as her chains would allow, her eyes bright with the first hope she had felt in centuries. Marcus Chen, she said, I am going to teach you how to cut through mathematics with a rusted blade. But first you need to understand what will happen if we succeed. We destroy the Vorthak power source and their empire collapses? Eventually, yes. But in the immediate term, we will release 500 years of stored energy all at once. The explosion will probably destroy this planet and everything within several light years. Marcus thought about his dead world, his murdered family, his teammates fighting and dying in the ruins above. He thought about the millions of species enslaved by the Vorthak Empire, and the billions more who would suffer if nothing changed. Will it hurt them? He asked. The Vorthak? Oh yes, Arya said with deep satisfaction. It will hurt them very much. Good, Marcus said and raised his knife. Tell me what to do. Teaching a human to cut through solid mathematics turned out to be like teaching a fish to operate a nuclear reactor. Theoretically impossible, practically insane, and surprisingly effective once you stopped caring about the laws of physics. The binding equations are not just symbols, Arya explained, her voice growing stronger as she focused on something other than her pain. They are living constructs made from crystallized logic. Each symbol represents a mathematical concept so pure and perfect that it has taken on physical form. Marcus nodded, though he understood maybe half of what she was saying. The knife in his hand was definitely changing. The steel was becoming brighter, more solid, as if it was learning to be more real than reality itself. The Vorthak built these chains by taking the fundamental laws of mathematics and twisting them into tools of imprisonment. Every equation feeds into every other equation, creating a network of logical relationships so complex that breaking any single part should be impossible. Should be? The Vorthak made one critical assumption, Arya continued. They assumed that anyone attempting to break the equations would use logic to fight logic. They prepared for systematic attacks, for careful analysis, for sophisticated mathematical countermeasures. Marcus waved his increasingly glowing knife. But I'm going to hit the math with a sharp stick until it goes away. Exactly. Human intuition operates on principles that mathematics cannot describe. When you look at these equations, you do not see elegant logical constructs, you see chains holding a prisoner. Your mind automatically rejects the mathematical validity of the system because it violates your emotional sense of justice. The air around them was getting warmer. Marcus could hear alarms going off somewhere far above, and the crystal formations in the walls were pulsing faster, as if the entire facility was getting excited about something. So, what do I actually do? Arya looked at the equation floating nearest to Marcus, a complex spiral of symbols that hurt to look at directly. You see that formation there? It is the primary stability matrix. In mathematical terms, it represents the logical foundation that makes my imprisonment theoretically justified. In human terms, it is the part of the chain that says I deserve to be here. Marcus felt something hot and angry unfold in his chest. Like hell it does. He raised his knife and slashed at the floating equation. The blade passed through empty air, but the symbols scattered like startled birds. Where the knife had touched, the mathematical constructs began to dissolve, unwinding from complex theorems back into simple arithmetic. The effect rippled outward through the binding matrix. Other equations began to flicker and fade as the logical foundation holding them in place crumbled. Arya gasped as some of the pressure on her mind eased for the first time in centuries. It worked, she whispered. It actually worked, but the victory was temporary. Even as the damaged equations faded away, new symbols began forming to replace them. The automated systems that maintained the binding were adapting, creating fresh logical justifications for Arya's imprisonment. "The system is repairing itself," Marcus said. "Watching the new equations take shape, of course it is. The Vorthak built redundancies into redundancies. But Marcus, do you see what is happening to your knife?" He looked down at the blade. It was definitely longer than it had been a moment ago, and brighter. The steel was taking on an opalescent quality, as if it was becoming something more than mere metal. "Every equation you destroy feeds its mathematical certainty into the blade," Arya explained. "The knife is becoming more real, more true, more capable of cutting through concepts that should not be cuttable. But we need to work faster. The longer we take, the more the system will adapt to your presence." Marcus nodded and moved to the next cluster of equations. These were darker, more twisted, concepts that made his eyes water and his mind recoil. "What are these ones?" "The justification matrices," Arya said grimly. "They contain the mathematical proof that my suffering serves the greater good of the galaxy." The Vorthak convinced themselves that torturing one being to power their empire was a morally acceptable trade-off. Math shouldn't be able to prove something like that. It cannot, but the Vorthak forced it to anyway, by defining greater good in ways that excluded my personhood. They reduced me to a variable in an equation rather than a living being with rights. Marcus looked at the twisted symbols and felt his anger crystallize into something cold and sharp. "This is the most disgusting thing I have ever seen." He slashed through the entire cluster in a single motion. The effect was immediate and violent. The justification matrices did not just fade. They exploded, sending shock waves of contradiction through the binding system. Dozens of secondary equations collapsed as their logical foundations disappeared. Arya cried out, but this time it was relief rather than pain. The knife was now glowing bright enough to hurt to look at, and Marcus could feel power flowing through the handle like electricity made of pure truth. "Marcus," Arya said urgently, "the primary control matrix, there, the large formation in the center. That is what defines the basic parameters of my imprisonment. If you can destroy that, I can see it." The primary control matrix was a nightmare of crystallized mathematics floating in the center of the chamber. It was beautiful in the way that horrible things sometimes are, complex beyond understanding, perfectly logical, and absolutely wrong in every way that mattered. Marcus could see the concepts embedded in the symbols, the idea that suffering was a resource to be harvested, that intelligence was a justification for enslavement, that power gave the right to destroy. 5 centuries of Vorthak philosophy made manifest as mathematical law. "This is going to take all of it," he said, looking at the knife. The blade was humming now, vibrating with accumulated certainty from all the equations he had destroyed. "I know," Arya said, "but Marcus, you should know when that matrix falls I will be free. And when I am free, the power I have been storing for 500 years will be released all at once. This facility, this planet, probably this entire solar system will be destroyed. What about you? I am Etherian. We are beings of energy and thought. The explosion will not destroy me. It will carry me back to the space between stars where my people once lived. But you," Marcus shrugged. "I'm not exactly planning a long and happy retirement. My planet is ash, my family is dead, and my civilization is at war with an enemy we cannot defeat. This is the best ending I could ask for. You could escape, run back to your people, warn them about what we are about to do, and let them think they failed? Let them die believing their sacrifice meant nothing?" Marcus shook his head. "No thanks. Besides, someone needs to make sure you actually get free. I don't trust math to keep its word." Arya looked at him for a long moment, and Marcus saw something in her eyes that he had never expected to see. Pride. Not in him, but in his species. In the stubborn, illogical, magnificently human refusal to accept defeat, even when victory was impossible. "Marcus Chen," she said formally, "in the name of the Etherian people, in memory of the countless worlds that have suffered under Vorthak rule, and in hope of a future where intelligence is not a justification for cruelty, I thank you. Just promise me one thing," Marcus said, raising the knife toward the primary control matrix. "When you get free, when you have all that power flowing through you again, remember what this felt like. Remember what it was like to be helpless. And when you find other species out there who are suffering the way you suffered, I will free them," Arya promised. "All of them. I will spend eternity undoing what the Vorthak have done. Marcus smiled. Good enough for me. He brought the knife down on the primary control matrix and the universe held its breath. For a moment, nothing happened. The blade hung in the air, touching symbols that described concepts too complex for human minds to fully grasp. Marcus could feel the mathematical certainty of the equations pressing against his consciousness, trying to convince him that what he was doing was impossible. Then his knife began to cut. The symbols parted like water, unraveling back into the basic components from which they had been built. The primary control matrix came apart in waves, sending cascades of mathematical contradictions through the entire binding system. And in the center of the chamber, Arya began to glow. 500 years of stolen power flowed back into her all at once, and Marcus watched a goddess remember what it felt like to be free. When the primary control matrix collapsed, reality remembered how to scream. The chamber erupted in light that had no color and sound that had no frequency. The crystal formations shattered and reformed in patterns that existed in more dimensions than space had room for. The air itself caught fire, burning with flames that fed on mathematics and left truth in their wake. And in the center of it all, Arya rose. 500 years of compressed agony and stolen power flooded back into her body all at once. Her physical form began to shift and change, revealing the truth that had been hidden beneath layers of binding equations. She was not just beautiful, she was beauty itself, made manifest in a way that rendered the concept of ugliness temporarily impossible. Her hair became streams of liquid starlight. Her skin took on the luminescence of nebulae being born. Her eyes opened fully for the first time in centuries, and Marcus saw the deep space between galaxies looking back at him. I remember, she whispered, and her voice was the sound of solar wind singing through the void. I remember what I was. The power flooding through her was beyond anything the Vorthak had imagined when they built their prison. They had thought they were capturing a single Etherian, one survivor of a dead species. They had not realized that Arya was not just the last of her kind. She was the living memory of her entire civilization. Every Etherian who had ever died, every thought they had ever thought, every dream they had ever dreamed, all of it had been stored within her consciousness, compressed and hidden away during the centuries of torture. Now it was all coming back at once, and with it came power that made stars look like candle flames. Marcus stumbled backward as waves of energy washed over him. His knife was dissolving in his hand, the metal unable to maintain its form in the presence of forces that operated on laws older than physics. But he was not afraid. He had done what he came to do. The facility, Arya said, her voice now carrying harmonics that made the crystal chamber ring like a bell. The power grid, the extraction systems, I can feel all of it connected to me. The entire Vorthak Empire has been running on my pain for 5 centuries. She raised her hand, and Marcus could see the energy flowing through the walls, up through the levels of the facility out to the city above. Every streetlight, every weapon, every starship in orbit, all of it connected to the being floating before him. Can you shut it down? Marcus asked. Arya smiled, and for a moment she looked almost human again. I can do better than that. The Vorthak thought they were clever, binding me with equations that turned my suffering into their power, but they made a critical error in their mathematical assumptions. What kind of error? They assumed that pain was the only emotion I could feel. The chamber began to shake as new energy patterns flowed through the crystal formations. But this was not the dark, twisted power that had been harvested from centuries of torture. This was something else entirely, bright and warm and filled with the kind of joy that only comes after long suffering has finally ended. Marcus, Arya said, what happens when you take a power grid designed to run on despair and suddenly flood it with 500 years of accumulated hope? Marcus grinned. It breaks? It breaks magnificently. Above them, across the surface of Zerion Prime, the lights began to flicker. In the capital city, Vorthak citizens looked up in confusion as their technology started behaving strangely. Street lamps burned too bright, then went dark. Communication networks filled with static that sounded almost like singing. Transportation systems stopped following their programmed routes and began moving in patterns that resembled dance steps. In the palace above the facility, emergency alarms wailed as ancient machines designed to process pure suffering suddenly found themselves trying to digest crystallized happiness. Control systems that had operated flawlessly for millennia began making decisions based on emotional logic rather than mathematical certainty. And in the Imperial throne room, Emperor Vorthak the Eternal felt his life support systems hiccup as they tried to process energy that tasted of freedom. "What is happening?" Marcus asked, feeling the vibrations growing stronger. "The cascade failure is spreading," Arya explained, her form now so bright that looking directly at her was like staring into a benevolent sun. "Every piece of Vorthak technology is connected to their power grid, and every piece of their power grid is now running on emotions they have never learned to process. Their computers are trying to calculate the mathematical value of hope. Their weapon systems are attempting to weaponize joy. Their starships are beginning to remember what it felt like to fly for fun rather than conquest." The chamber was coming apart around them now, but Marcus found that he was not concerned. The destruction felt cleansing rather than violent, like watching a cancer burn away to reveal healthy tissue beneath. "How long do we have?" he asked. "Minutes," Arya said. "The energy I have been storing will soon reach critical mass. When it does, the explosion will destroy this planet and carry me back to the stars." "But Marcus..." She turned to look at him, and for a moment the cosmic forces flowing around her calmed to something approaching normal physics. "I cannot take you with me. Your people exist in normal space-time. The explosion will..." "I know," Marcus said. "It's okay. I made my choice. But your sacrifice will not be forgotten. When I return to the space between stars, I will carry the memory of what you did here. The story of the human who cut through mathematics with a rusted blade will be told to every species I liberate. And there will be many. The Vorthak Empire spans thousands of worlds, and each one will need to be freed." Marcus nodded. He was thinking about his teammates probably dead now in the ruins above. He was thinking about Earth burning in the void. He was thinking about all the human colonies that had fallen to Vorthak weapons powered by this woman's pain. But mostly, he was thinking about the look of wonder on Arya's face as she remembered how to be free. "Just promise me something," he said as the facility began to collapse around them. "Anything. When you find my people, the humans who survived this war, tell them what happened here. Tell them that sometimes the best way to solve an impossible problem is to hit it with something until it breaks. Tell them that being too stupid to know when you're beaten is actually a superpower." Arya laughed, and the sound made the dying crystal formations sing in harmony. "I will tell them that Marcus Chen looked at 500 years of crystallized mathematics and decided it needed a good stabbing. I will tell them that human stubbornness is a force of nature that can break the laws of physics. I will tell them that their species has a gift for finding hope in hopeless places." The energy around them was reaching the critical threshold now. Marcus could feel his body beginning to dissolve at the edges, not destroyed but transformed into something that could survive what was about to happen. "And Marcus," Arya said, her form now so bright that she was becoming difficult to see, "I will tell them that when the universe forgets how to hope, it should find the nearest human and ask them to explain why giving up is not an option." The explosion, when it came, was not violent. It was the mathematical opposite of violence, the release of every beautiful thing that had been compressed and hidden during centuries of suffering. It was joy made manifest on a stellar scale, hope given enough energy to remake reality, love powerful enough to heal wounds that had been carved into the structure of space-time itself. The planet Zerion Prime simply ceased to exist, not destroyed but transformed into something better. The energy wave spread outward at speeds that made light look lazy, carrying with it a simple message that every piece of Vorthak technology could understand. Pain was not the only force in the universe, and in the space between stars, where light went to rest and dreams took on physical form, Arya opened her eyes and began to plan the liberation of a galaxy. But first, she had a promise to keep. Somewhere in the darkness between dead worlds, a small group of human ships was limping toward safety, carrying the last survivors of their species. They had no way of knowing that their impossible mission had succeeded, that their sacrifice had toppled an empire, that their stubborn refusal to accept defeat had freed a goddess and changed the course of galactic history. Arya smiled and began to fly toward them, carrying with her the story of Marcus Chen and his rusted blade. The human refugee fleet was 3 days away from complete fuel exhaustion when salvation arrived in the form of a goddess riding a wave of crystallized starlight. Commander Sarah Torres was on the bridge of the last functional human warship when the sensors started reporting impossible readings. Energy signatures that operated according to physics that had not been invented yet. Spatial distortions that looked like someone was rewriting the laws of reality in real time, and approaching from the direction of what used to be the Vorthak homeworld, something that registered as both a single entity and an entire civilization. "Is that a ship?" asked Lieutenant Kim, the only other survivor of the strike team that had gone to Zerion Prime. "No," Torres said, staring at the readings. "That's something else entirely." The entity that had once been called Arya materialized alongside the human fleet without any obvious means of propulsion. She looked almost human now, but human in the way that a painting of a person looks human, recognizably similar to the original while being obviously something more. Her message reached every human ship simultaneously, transmitted directly into their communication systems without any detectable signal. "Humans of Earth," her voice said, carrying harmonics that made hardened soldiers weep with emotions they could not name. "I am Arya, last daughter of the Etherian people. I come to you with news of victory, with gratitude beyond measure, and with a gift that your species has earned through sacrifice." On the bridge of the flagship, Admiral Richardson, the highest-ranking human military officer still alive, tried to find his voice. "This is Admiral Richardson of the Human Colonial Defense Force. To whom am I speaking?" "I am the one your soldier Marcus Chen freed from 5 centuries of imprisonment. I am the power source that once fueled the Vorthak Empire, and I'm here to tell you that your war is over." The words hit the human fleet like a physical force. After 6 months of running, fighting, and watching their civilization burn, the concept of victory had become almost incomprehensible. "Over?" Richardson managed to ask. "The Vorthak Empire has fallen," Arya announced, and across the fleet humans began to cry. Their technology has failed. Their worlds have gone dark. Their armies have surrendered or scattered. The galaxy is free, and it is free because one human with a rusted knife refused to accept that mathematics was stronger than justice. She told them the story then, projecting images directly into their minds so they could see what had happened in the crystal chamber beneath Zerion Prime. She showed them Marcus Chen, their stubborn, magnificent, completely insane fellow human, looking at an impossible problem and solving it by hitting it with a sharp stick until it went away. We showed them the moment when 500 years of accumulated suffering transformed into 500 years of accumulated hope, and how that hope had spread through the Vorthak power grid like a virus made of joy. She showed them the cascade failure that had brought down an empire, triggered by the simple human conviction that some things were wrong regardless of how logically justified they might be. "Marcus Chen is dead," Arya said gently, "but his sacrifice has freed not just me but every species the Vorthak ever enslaved. The galaxy owes humanity a debt that can never be repaid. What happens now?" Torres asked from her ship's bridge. Arya smiled, and her expression carried enough warmth to heat a solar system. "Now you go home. All of you. I have already begun the work of restoration. Your worlds will be rebuilt, your dead will be honored, your civilization will flourish again. But first there is something I must show you." Space around the human fleet began to shimmer and shift. Stars moved in their orbits, not violently but gracefully, like dancers rearranging themselves for a new performance. Planets appeared where none had been before, green and blue and brown with atmospheres that sparkled with the promise of life. "The Vorthak destroyed much," Arya said, "but I am Etherian. We were builders and dreamers before we became victims. These worlds are my gift to humanity, not as payment for what your species did, but as recognition of what your species is." Admiral Richardson stared at the display showing dozens of habitable worlds appearing in previously empty space. This is impossible. You cannot just create planets." "I am not creating them," Arya explained. "I am restoring them. These worlds existed before the Vorthak came, before they were strip-mined and burned and turned into fuel for conquest. I am simply returning them to what they were meant to be." The restoration was happening faster now. Entire solar systems were blooming into existence, not built but remembered back into being. Oceans filled with water that had been scattered as vapor. Forests grew from soil that had been reduced to ash. Cities rose from ruins that had been forgotten for millennia. "But you must understand," Arya continued, "what I am offering you is not charity. It is partnership. The galaxy is vast, and there are still species out there who suffer under tyrants and slavers and those who believe might makes right. The Etherian people are gone, but their work remains unfinished. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of prophecy. Humanity has proven something that the rest of the galaxy had begun to forget. That sometimes the right thing to do is also the impossible thing to do. That intelligence without compassion is not evolution but disease. That the strongest force in the universe is not logic or mathematics or technology, but the simple refusal to let suffering continue when you have the power to stop it. On ships throughout the fleet, humans were beginning to understand what she was offering them. "You want us to help," Torres said. "I want you to be who you have already proven yourselves to be," Arya replied. "The galaxy needs humans, Sarah Torres. It needs beings who will look at impossible odds and charge anyway. It needs people who solve mathematical problems with crowbars and emotional conviction. It needs a species that is just crazy enough to cut through the laws of physics when those laws are being used to justify cruelty." She gestured toward the restored worlds, growing around them like flowers made of stone and atmosphere. "These worlds will be your new homes if you choose to accept them, but they will also be your bases of operations for something larger. Together, we will travel to every corner of the galaxy. We will find every species that suffers under oppression, and we will free them all." The human fleet hung in space, surrounded by impossible beauty, and offered an impossible mission. Admiral Richardson was the first to respond. "Ma'am," he said formally, "the Human Colonial Defense Force accepts your proposal. We'll need some time to reorganize, resupply, and mourn our dead. But after that we go back to work," Torres finished from her bridge. "Because that's what humans do. We find problems and we fix them, usually in the most ridiculous way possible." Arya laughed, and her laughter made the newborn stars shine brighter. "Marcus Chen told me to tell you something," she said. "He wanted you to know that being too stubborn to know when you're beaten is actually a superpower. He wanted you to remember that the best way to solve an impossible problem is to hit it with something until it breaks." She paused, and her voice grew softer, more personal. "He also wanted you to know that sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to let mathematics be more important than people." The restored worlds spun in their orbits, waiting to be explored and settled and turned into homes for a species that had proven itself worthy of impossible gifts. The galaxy stretched out before them, full of challenges and wonders and people who needed saving. And in the space between stars, where hope took on physical form and dreams became destiny, a goddess who had once been a prisoner began planning the next phase of a liberation that would span millennia. But first, she had worlds to build and humans to guide home. After all, she had made a promise to a man with a rusted knife, and promises were the strongest force in any universe.